Welcome to the Objectivism Book Study. We are moving in Leonard Peikoff's book toward the material on epistemology. We are still in the anteroom. To show what an objectivist view of epistemology is and why it is credible, Peikoff is confronting some of the questions and the claims of philosophical skeptics and philosophical idealists. And he is working toward an account of where man's knowledge comes from and how it is rooted in observation. So this session, we are looking at pages 44 through 47, sensory qualities as real, and 48 through 52, consciousness as possessing identity. What are we hoping to accomplish in these discussions? Well, at For the New Christian Intellectual, christianintellectual.com, we want Christians to understand Ayn Rand's philosophical system. There are important and even unique points to be found in Ayn Rand's philosophy. With discernment, Christians should be willing to plunder the wealth of the pagans, even in terms of philosophical insight. Truth is to be accepted no matter where it is found. So, at christianintellectual.com, we aim to serve the church by helping Christians to understand the true and the false in the best that philosophers have to offer, including Ayn Rand in particular. You are invited to join us as we work through a robust Christian response to Ayn Rand's philosophy. It is free, and you can get the details at christianintellectual.com/objectivism. So in this series of discussions, you're going to get the chance to judge the importance of Ayn Rand's work for yourself by learning her ideas, by interacting with them in the company of Christians. You can get past replays, and you can register at christianintellectual.com/objectivism. The section that we are in is a bit technical, and it can be a challenge to relate the pieces of information that we are analyzing to our broader purposes as students of philosophy. We study philosophy so that we can live well, and so that we can give proper care to our thinking. Philosophical knowledge is a benefit for self-defense when people try to criticize your convictions, but it's not mainly used for that. Philosophical knowledge is mainly to be used for living. So I thought, as we begin our discussion today, before we get too far into the specific details of this material, I wanted to take a step back, give you an overview of the kind of benefit that we find from philosophy. So I'm going to share some of the top principles that I've learned as I've read through this book by Leonard Peikoff. So these are concise principles of logic and reasoning, and I'll just give you 5, but these are all found in the OPAR book that we're reading. And as I share these ideas, do not simply ask, is that true? Ask yourself more than that. Ask, what would it look like to live in light of the fact that these ideas are true? What would it mean as far as your specific actions today? So here are 5 principles that sort of their takeaway application points from OPAR. Number 1, all our knowledge is based on observation and logic. So that's a point that we've got to so far, but now how would you apply that in your own life? Do you seek, when you have an idea in your mind or when you hear an idea from somebody else, to try to reduce it to observations? Do you have a habit mentally of doing that? If you can reduce claims to their basis in reality, that will help you understand them more clearly. It will help you test whether they are true. Another application point from the kind of material that we're using. Number 2, logic is the art of non-contradictory identification. So here's how I would apply that one. If I am thinking about my own life, do I work to identify the types of people or the types of activities in my life that exist? So like, there's these hobbies, there's these things that I do for my work, there's these kinds of people that I encounter each day. Do I attempt to identify their natures as I'm thinking about them? What kind of hobby is this? What kind of person is this? And do I try to embrace the full truth about them? All the facts about them in a non-contradictory way, not just some of the facts. Do I follow the truth where it leads? So logic is the art of non-contradictory identification. Number 3 is always ask what facts of reality give rise to the need for whatever concept I'm trying to hold in my mind. Now this is such a beneficial thing if you're looking at philosophy, to always ask what facts of reality give rise to the need for this idea or this concept. So this would be true when we're looking at new words or concepts, especially abstract ones, like the kind that we're going to be discussing in ethics or in political theory. So we ask ourselves, how did I get to the definition of this idea that I'm using? Where did it come from? Have you checked that all of the concepts that you're using are well-formed, that they're grounded in something observable that you could explain to another person? You've heard the expression, explain it like I'm 5. You know that you've mastered the material when you can explain it to a 5-year-old, to a 10-year-old, and to a 16-year-old, and to a 30-year-old. And ultimately, the explanations, no matter who it is that we're talking to, have to be of the kind where you can say it's grounded in this observation, and you could explain it by pointing. That's when you know that you understand it. When you could say, you just look at this, and then think about this, think about these facts. And that's how you know that you've grounded your concepts in something in reality itself. So that question is always ask, what facts of reality give rise to the need for this concept? I think that is such a helpful approach, especially in an anti-philosophical society, in a society that doesn't really understand that. Okay, we have 2 more. Number 4 is to think in essentials. Ask, on what fundamental principle does this question depend? This has been such a helpful thinking tip whenever I have a conversation with people and I disagree with something that they're saying. I ask, well, what's the fundamental? What's the premise behind this? Or which is the application? Which is the derivative versus which is the more fundamental? Just understanding those 2 terms, derivative and fundamental, can be incredibly illuminating. So are you interested in identifying relationships of hierarchy between what is more fundamental and what is less fundamental, what is more derivative? Do you use that as a mental tool that will make you amazingly more capable of analyzing? Last tip for today, and I'll share 5 more next week, but for today, number 5 is check your premises. I just love that. That's why at the end of a lot of my emails, I say good premises. So when was the last time that you said to yourself, self, check your premises? This can be a valuable direction to go when you are confused by an idea. So ask what other ideas that whatever your idea you're thinking of depends on. Use that concept of derivative and fundamental. Ask, what does this depend on? What are my premises? And then you ask yourself, well, are the premises themselves clearly defined? Are they true? That can be an amazing tool for understanding your emotions, for understanding your goals, your challenges, conflicts, for understanding why people think differently than you do. Whatever it is, check your premises is such a helpful tool for our lives. So I want to thank all the people that are watching live in the webinar right now on Zoom, and you can do this in the future. If you're not on right now, join next week or jump in right now if you'd like to. We have a time for just a couple of questions about the reading this week, and then I want to actually walk through sequentially in the reading. So any questions come to mind off the top of your head about the reading this week that you want to make sure to discuss? Go ahead and you can unmute and you can come on. Andrew Boone had listed one. He had said that he wanted to discuss in the middle of page 50 some issues about Kant. And there were some other topics that I would definitely like to touch on.
Sure. So on page 50, it comes at the end of a discussion of certain of Immanuel Kant and other sort of hyper-skeptical philosophers' attacks on the senses as valid. And you'll hear a lot of these things like, how can we really trust what we see? Because after all, when we see something, it's being filtered in through our biological mechanisms of perception. And so that therefore we're not really perceiving reality. And then if you get more into what Kant taught, he also said, well, because we have what he called these categories that automatically synthesize the raw material of the noumenal realm, he said, because we have minds that are sort of categorizing our data, we're not really getting at reality. And so I thought it'd be worth reading this little paragraph. It's kind of a reductio ad absurdum of that position that says, what sort of consciousness can perceive reality in the Kantian anti-identity approach? The answer is a consciousness not limited by any means of cognition, a consciousness which perceives no how, a consciousness which is not of this kind as against that, a consciousness which is nothing in particular, i.e. which is nothing, i.e. which does not exist. This is the ideal of the Kantian argument and the standard it uses to measure cognitive validity. The standard is not human consciousness or even an invented consciousness claimed to be superior to man's, but a zero, a vacuum, a nullity, a non-anything. And then he goes on to say, I thought this was great. That approach implies that man is blind because he has eyes and deaf because he has ears and so on. And I think that's really helpful because sometimes you'll come across a very, very sophisticated, I mean, Kant was a very sophisticated philosopher, and you'll come across these systems that are very sophisticated to try to get you to doubt the fact that you really can sense what you sense with your senses. And it's good to say, okay, wait a second. What would the alternative be? Like, what do we not have that would be better than what we have? And so I think it's a good kind of, that paragraph is a good representation of the really good stuff in this kind of couple of sections we're looking at today. There is a paragraph before that where he kind of uses his observations and conclusions to try to kind of poke holes in the idea of God that we might want to get to during this discussion at some point.
Great. Yeah, that whole section there is the payoff of a lot of what he's been working toward. Other topics that came up that anyone would want to make sure that we include in the discussion today? And I'll write them down. All right, we're going to move forward. So let me go ahead and introduce the reading. We'll start at page 44. It's sensory qualities as real. He talks about the metaphysical status of sensory qualities themselves. Now, this is answering some of the kinds of questions that have been raised by people like David Hume or before that led into a skeptical set of conclusions. And so then he says, distinguish between form and object. The form, the aspects of the perceived world that derive from our form of perception, such as colors, sounds, and smells, and then the object, the aspects that belong to metaphysical reality itself apart from us. So he's giving us some categories to think about there. Yeah, so we agree with the general line of philosophical history that would distinguish between, there's such a thing as a smell or a color. The qualia is the word that we might describe. Sure, there is such thing as qualia, and they're different from the thing in itself because it's referring to our mechanism or our form of perceiving. Like, where is the redness? That's the kind of question that is being discussed here. And if you're familiar with Kant and his distinction between the phenomenal world and the noumenal world, you'll remember these questions about trying to understand qualia and what they are eventually led to Kant's system, which was devastating to the history of philosophy. He was considered to be the all-destroyer because of the kind of solution that he proposed and because of the fact that it was embraced. But we can go forward. We're not discussing Kant in particular here, but that's some context. I'm going to read the next part. It says, many philosophers have concluded the senses must be condemned as deceivers because the world of colored, sounding, odoriferous objects they reveal is utterly unlike actual reality. And eventually, I think in the next page or 2, 3, we'll get to this idea of the two tables problem. The table that we see, and then the table of physics, which tells us that the tables are composed of atoms and that there's actually space between the atoms, which we don't perceive. So then the question is, okay, so there's the way we perceive, but then there's other facts about the table or whatever object that we don't perceive. So how do we know that what we do perceive is reliable? And this is what the chapter begins to give an account for. Going to the bottom of page 44, the task of identifying the nature of physical objects as they are, apart from man's form of perception, does not belong to philosophy, but to physics. There is no philosophical method of discovering the fundamental attributes of matter. There's only the scientist method of specialized observation. So he's delineating between what philosophy can do and should do, and what science can do and should do. And then he has this whole set of arguments here where he says, just take, for instance, if we were able to reduce everything that there is in the universe just to scientific knowledge, what would be the philosophical implications of that? And here it sounds like he's doing a thought experiment about what if materialism were true. And I don't know for sure if he is actually advocating materialism. Jacob, do you think he's advocating materialism in this section, top of page 45?
No, I think it's more a hypothetical. It's a thought experiment. I'd have to read the entire section with that particular question in mind. I might try to skim it real fast, and I'll let you know if I think differently after I do. But I'm pretty sure it was just a thought experiment.
Yeah, he says, suppose that scientists know the ultimate ingredients of the universe, the irreducible building blocks that combine to make up the physical objects, and so on. So I mean, if that were the case, that the universe were only physical, And I guess you'd have to say that consciousness arises from the substrata. It's an emergent property on this hypothetical. Even if that were the case, and if we could account for everything as scientists, we've obtained omniscience scientifically, that would not somehow mean that consciousness is not real. At least not on my understanding. I don't think on his either. And it would not mean that people are not people, that tables are not tables. It would just mean that we understand how things are functioning on the level of what we perceive, tables, and how they are functioning on the level of the atomic structure. It would just mean that we know what they're doing. We know we are able to account in more ways for what the thing is. That doesn't take away from what we know about what the thing is. It just adds to what we know. And you're going to see the similar pattern of thought when we get to the theory of concepts. Suppose that a child knows that this is a table and that you can touch it and that it has a certain color, has a certain feel when you touch it, but he doesn't know the concept of weight. But eventually he's going to learn other qualities that are contained or that are part of this table. That doesn't take away from the fact that he actually knew what he did know. So that's the philosophical point he wants to make here, is you cannot argue for skepticism or argue against human knowledge based on the fact that there's more knowledge that we haven't yet attained in the scientific. So in the middle of page 45, there's a paragraph that begins, even under the present hypothesis, such objects and qualities would not be products of consciousness. And that's what he's wanting to get at, is that the theory or the implication that of subjectivism, that it's our minds that are creating the things, there's just no basis for that. He says the things we perceive in this theory would not be primaries, they would nevertheless be unimpeachably real. So, I mean, just like if you were to, just as an analogy, if you were to consider when you're watching a film, and it may be helpful to consider old-fashioned film where the film runs by, you're watching a film and it's real, but it's composed of individual little pictures, and you're not seeing the individual little pictures one at a time. But nevertheless, what you're seeing is also real. It's just an emergent property of the components. But it is part of what you're seeing something that's real. He says the things we perceive in this theory would not be primaries, but they would nevertheless be unimpeachably real. A thing may not be condemned as unreal on the grounds that it is only an effect. Imagine calling a movie only an effect, therefore the movie doesn't exist. Well, likewise, imagine saying that love has certain qualities to it, like there's chemicals like dopamine that come into your brain, and therefore it's not real. It's just silly. And this actually does remind me of some experiments that I've heard of where there's drugs that induce emotions, and the experience of somebody that is injected with this drug to, for example, experience an emotion of joy or of sadness or whatever it is, the experience comes when they receive the injection, but it's also detached somehow from it feels detached. So what people have reported is, I feel this feeling like joy, but it doesn't feel like real joy. Or I can feel this feeling like sadness, but it doesn't feel like real sadness. And my understanding of why that would be is because there are drugs in your brain that can cause a certain type of experience, but we are more than just the drugs. We are also the way that we think about our life. Not just the way our body works, but the way our mind, not our brain, but our mind works. And so if you were to expose somebody to this drug of joy, but they didn't actually have any cause for joy in the circumstances of their life, like the joy of being with your wife, or the joy of being with your kids or something, the joy of experiencing something brand new that's interesting, it separated from the experiences of joy and the mental work that goes into creating joy. It just feels like a shell. It feels like a sugar rush, but not like something more than that. I just point that out. I think that that's related here. You could explain, the joy on Christmas Day of opening presents in terms of chemicals, but that would not be a sufficient explanation. Any interactions with that?
Yeah, I was thinking about imagine a world where or a civilization where maybe if you've seen the movie The Village, you'll know what I'm talking about, where they don't have anything that's red.
Yes.
They only have one thing, and it's like a red flower. Okay. And then one day, like halfway, like when you're in your 20s, you see a red bird, and you're like, this is weird. This is making me feel like I'm looking at a flower, because in your mind that's the only thing that's caused you to have that experience. You know it's not that for other independent reasons. And that also is kind of like your example with drugs that can make you feel an emotion. And people want to make the unjustified leap to say there is no mind, there is only the chemicals. I remember Jacob debated a guy one time who was saying the synapses in your brain are the experience that you are having of this computer screen right in front of you. But that's only because those things go together. And so I think it's helpful to think about this, and to think about it's perfectly valid to say we have an experience because of certain physical things. Like those things are a necessary condition for our experience to take place, but they're not the same thing as our experience.
Yeah, there's a famous thought experiment in philosophy about a scientist named Mary who has never left this chamber, this colorless chamber. But she has studied sight and the phenomena of color, and all of her life, and so she knows everything there is to know about what happens in our neurons, in our brain chemistry, everything else when we look at color. She understands everything about it, everything that could possibly be said about it, but she's never seen the color red or the color blue, right? And the question is, does she learn something new when she steps out of the chamber and sees color? And the obvious answer is yes, even though she knew everything there was to know about all of the neurological and physiological interactions that go on in our brains whenever we see color. There's a difference between that, the physiological cause of it, so to speak, or you could say the physiological result of it, and the actual qualia, right? The actual experience of seeing the color. And that is, the point is to show that there's a difference between our physiology and our mind.
Let's go on in the reading to page 46 to the middle. I'll read that. It says, the dominant tradition among philosophers has defined only two possibilities in regard to sensory qualities, that they are in the object or in the mind. Now, this was written, around 1990, 1991. There may have been more academic discussion in the time in between now and then. I don't know. Jacob, you may know. But so generally, when he's describing the dominant positions historically in philosophy, just keep in mind that this may have been the dominant positions in the past. I don't know what work has been done, and I don't think that his point is to comment on that. His point is just to say that historically, some of the influences that have shaped our society have been such. So dominant traditions, they've tried to define only two possibilities in regard to sensory qualities. They are in the object or in the mind. The former is taken to subsume qualities independent of man's means of perception. The latter is taken to mean subjective and or unreal. And then he writes, Ayn Rand regards this alternative as defective. A quality that derives from an interaction between external objects and man's perceptual apparatus belongs to neither category. This is a common theme within objectivism, is that they will say that there's always been presented this two options, and we reject option A, we reject option B, because we think that there's a different way of looking at it that doesn't exclude the truth that A was intending to highlight, or the truth that B was intending to highlight. And so they always try to connect that which is in existence, reality, and then that which is in the mind, and which is apprehended by reason. And they try to draw a connection between reality and reason. And that's a helpful framework for understanding anything that the objectivists are doing, whether it's in ethics or whether it is in epistemology. They try to say, how can we make sure that the way that we're accounting for philosophical concepts accounts both for reality and for reason, both for existence and the mind. So they go on So a quality that derives from an interaction between external objects and man's perceptual apparatus belongs to neither category. Such a quality, for example, color, is not a dream or a hallucination, so it's not just in the mind, apart from the object. Rather, it is man's form. I think this is a helpful way of accounting for it. It is man's form of grasping the object. Nor is the quality in the object apart from man. It is man's form of grasping the object, so you cannot omit the role of the mind when you discuss qualia. You have to say it's man's form of grasping the object.
Yeah, let me interject real fast. There are some people who would use like that thought experiment that I just used to try to say, therefore, it is only in the mind. It's not in the thing. It's not a feature of reality at all. And I think the way to conceptualize it, which is a different way of saying what Peikoff is saying here, is that you're right. The color itself, the qualia itself, isn't in the object, but the features that give rise to that qualia when my consciousness encounters the object are in the object, right? The thing that makes the object appear blue to me rather than red are in the object. That there's a reason that I see a blue thing as blue and a red thing as red and not vice versa. And it's because they've got different features in themselves, in reality, that are interacting with my consciousness in different ways because of the differences they have in themselves. So there are actual differences in the things that we are perceiving. It's just not that the difference isn't the same thing as the qualia that we're experiencing. Does that make sense? And is that helpful?
Yeah, it does. I would also just add, though, that the qualities of the object that's being perceived are not sufficient for the experience, because the colorblind person sees it differently than the normal sighted person. And so it's the interaction, it's the two things understood together that leads to the experience.
Yeah, and I wanted to add too, if you're unsure of whether Jacob and Cody are correct here, if you want to check this, here's how I'm giving you a glimpse into my thought process and how I'm checking to make sure that they're correct. And one piece of evidence is when I was 16, I caused a wreck because I thought that the light was green, but it was red. I thought that the light on the traffic signal was green, which presupposes that there was a truth to reality about a color, in this case, red or green. But I was mistaken about it. But if the qualities are only in our minds, then that would contradict this experience that I had. That really can't be true. So when we're saying, hey, look at the color of the stoplight, you can think about that experience that you anytime you're at a traffic signal. This is a common example. You can think about the fact that what you're trying to say is, I need to get some information from reality that could be this or that, and it has to do with color. So you know that there has to be something about physical reality that your sense perception completely depends on, that is a but-for cause of it. That doesn't mean that our senses don't play a role in making those colors look a certain way. But I think that's one way that you can, if you're thinking, is it true that there's something in reality that has, that gives rise to these? That's a way to check that.
There wasn't, then you wouldn't be held accountable for running the red light.
Exactly.
Right?
Officer, it was green to me.
Yeah.
All right, let's go to the next part. So down in that paragraph, Peikoff points out such products introduce a third alternative. They are not object alone or perceiver alone, but object as perceived. And I'd just like to highlight the idea that this object as perceived, this is going to be a theme that you're going to see when we get to the theory of concepts as well. And when we get to the theory of objectivity, objectivity is going to involve being reality oriented by a specific means that is appropriate to man's nature. So it's just another way of getting at this idea of being oriented to the objects, but objects as perceived. And even when we get to ethics, there's going to be, at least within the objectivist way of understanding ethics, they're going to say that values is a concept that you cannot discuss coherently without using this framework of the object as perceived. Nothing is a value until it is a value to something, to someone. All right, let's go to top of page 47. And feel free to interject. We have time today if anyone wants to interject at any point. But the top of page 47, the source of the sensory form is thus not consciousness, but existential fact, independent of consciousness. But then he goes on, in this sense, everything we perceive, including those qualities that depend on man's physical organs, is out there. So there is a sense in which everything we perceive is out there, just as Jacob said. Next paragraph, those who condemn the senses as deceptive on the grounds that sense qualities are merely effects on men are guilty of rewriting reality. A common theme with the views that objectivism is setting out to reject is that they try to rewrite reality. And in this case, it means a demand that I demand that the senses give me not effects, but irreducible primaries. And he's pointed out that that's just not the way the world works. And so we need to operate on how the world works. He goes on, human perception, human is what he's talking about. Human perception is necessarily a process of interaction. There is no way to perceive an object that does not somehow impinge on one's body, since qualities therefore must be effects. To reject the senses for this reason is to reject them for existing. Now, if we were to, as Christians, try to ask, how does God fit into all of this? Does God have perception? We could, but so we might have some quibbles with some of the statements that he's going to make that could impinge on what we know about God. But for the sake of this discussion, I think we're talking about human discussion. Go to the bottom of page 47. Last sentence in the second to last paragraph there. It says, consciousness is not a faculty of reproduction, but of perception. Here, I believe he's countering one of the thought experiments that has been common in the history of philosophy, which is, you may have seen this in illustration where there's a man's head, and then inside his head, there's a little man, and the little man is looking at a picture. So it's like the eyes have reproduced an image inside his mind, but then there's a little person who's looking at that picture. There's a name for this thought experiment. It slips my mind. But the point that he's making here is, no, the eyes do not just reproduce an image and then there's another person that's looking at that image and interpreting it. That just creates a infinite regress problem. So, in fact, consciousness and our eyes and the process of taking in the information from outside and getting it into our minds, consciousness its function is not to create and then study an inner world that duplicates the outer world. Its function is directly to look outward, to perceive that which exists, and to do so by a certain means. So we have some kind of direct contact with the light waves, with the pressure when we push on something, with the sound waves, with the smells and tastes. Direct contact. We're not in a simulation inside our mind, and the simulation is reproducing an experience. It just is the experience. That's all. Go to the middle of page 48. He writes, although Ayn Rand's theory of perception has sometimes been called naive realism, this term does not apply. He explains why. We don't have to go into that right now, but I think that's helpful to point out that naive realism it's a different theory, and you can look at Thomas Reid in the Scottish common sense school and common sense realism, and it would be fruitful to compare what Rand is saying to what Reid was saying and what others have said in interacting with David Hume. The thing I would just want to point out here is that Thomas Reid was an able critic of Hume, to the point where, if I recall, they lived at the same time, and when Reid responded to some of Hume's work, Hume looked at it and he said, yeah, I think you're right. So, and you might need to check the historical details on that, but if I recall, there was enough of interaction between them where Reid was able to defuse some of the bombs that Hume was trying to build. And sadly, in the history of philosophy, Reid has been, at least for a century or more, he was largely forgotten. He's been resuscitated now, but it was Immanuel Kant who built on Hume that ended up shaping the direction of the history of philosophy, around the time of the American Revolution and after, which is unfortunate. It's too bad we didn't have more Reid. Just as a side note, the founding fathers would have been in the school of Thomas Reid. They would have been common sense realists, and that partly accounts for why they were so good at what they did. Going to the next section. So we're now in a new subsection in the chapter, consciousness as possessing identity. Ayn Rand's crucial principle is that consciousness has identity. Everything has identity. Now, he has this section here where he says some things about consciousness that I would like to see what it says about. I would like to see if there's any implications here on God's consciousness. So let me read this. Every existent is bound by the laws of identity and causality. This applies not only to the physical world, but also to consciousness. Any consciousness of any species is what it is. It is limited, finite, lawful. It is a faculty with a nature that includes specific instrumentalities that enable it to achieve awareness. It is something that has to grasp its objects somehow. Now, I don't know how this would apply to God. I'm just going to point that out, especially the concept of God's knowledge being limited and finite.
So I think it's important to point out that the way that Peikoff is using the terminology of limited and finite, it is just to say that it is lawful, right? That's the third adjective he uses there, meaning it has an identity, it has a nature. And I think that is accurate, right? God's consciousness is what it is. It can't be other than what it is. His consciousness couldn't be the same thing as our consciousness. And there are quote unquote restrictions on his consciousness in that sense, right? Logical impossibilities regarding his consciousness. And in that sense, you could say it's finite. The way in which we as theists would affirm that it is infinite would be in respect to certain other aspects, which we can get into later if we want to. But whenever we talk about finiteness or infinitude, it's important to specify in what respect, right? In respect to its nature, absolutely. God himself is finite in respect to his nature, right? Because he is himself. He's not me. He's not a serpent. He's not Satan. He is what he is and not something else. And in that respect, in respect to his nature or essence, there is finitude, quote unquote, right? To speak loosely. But there are other important respects in which he is infinite, which we can talk about later if we want to.
That's very helpful. And that's going to be a common theme whenever the objectivists criticize God for being an infinite idea, and they say, well, therefore he doesn't exist because he's not any specific thing. We can always say, well, there is some nuance there, to use our favorite word. So let's go to top of page 49. The fact that consciousness has identity is self-evident, of course. And then he compares this conviction that consciousness has identity with some attacks. So he says, Kant-inspired attacks on human cognition as such begin with the opposite premise. They begin with the premise that consciousness should not have identity and conclude that since it does, consciousness is invalid. When he says that consciousness should not have identity, that idea is just to say that what we would like if we had created the world was that we would know things without any specific means of knowing them. So consciousness doesn't have an identity. This sounds a lot like Van Til. I'll just point that out. Anybody want to add anything about that before we move forward? Okay. In regard to the senses, the standard argument, long a staple of skeptics, has been indicated. A certain object looks red or sounds loud or feels solid, but that is partly because of the nature of human eyes, ears, or touch. Therefore, we are cut off from the external world. We do not perceive reality as it really is, but only reality as it appears to man. Reality as it really is something that comes up in Kant. And that's the idea. It's just a confused notion that ends up resulting in trying to solve a whole bunch of problems that don't exist. And when you do that, you get the destruction that we see in Kant. Bottom of page 49, even the most meticulous proof depends on our senses of what is logical, which must depend in part on... Okay, so now, this is him reporting on somebody else's idea. This is not his idea. Even the most meticulous proof depends on our sense of what is logical, some might say, which must depend in part on the kind of mental constitution that we have. The real truth of any question is therefore unknowable. So he's reporting on Kant here. And this does remind me of Cornelius Van Til quite a bit. And I mean, there's a reason for that historically, is that Van Til's ideological lineage comes from Kant and from the Germans in that school, and Netherlands as well. And the immediate predecessors of Kant, of Van Til, if we could think about it, would be, let's see, you guys recall?
Dewey Weird is definitely in there,
Yeah, is it Doivard?
in between Kant and Van Til.
Yes.
Yeah,
And
Kuiper would be one too.
Kuiper is one. There's another systematic theologian that's considered important.
Are you thinking Bavinck?
I was thinking Bavinck.
Yeah, I think so. Yeah.
They are all largely within that time period, and they are somewhat influenced by Hegelian idealism, and before that by Fichte and Kant and others. Okay, so in this section here, where he's talking about this idea that to have a the meticulous proof depends on our senses of what is logical, a sense of it. That reminded me of a conversation that Jacob and I were having, where we were talking about analytic and synthetic truths, and whether or not the principle that A is A and A is always A, the law of identity, whether that is an analytic truth or whether that is itself synthetic, that is inductive or something like that. So any comments that you have on that, Jacob? I'm not sure I have a lot of thoughts on it, but I just would raise it as an issue.
Not necessarily on that particular discussion that we were having, but I would say that I think it seems like Peikoff might be granting too much to his opponent here in this paragraph, in the sense that I would say that it's not true that you could have human logic that is distinct from some other law. Like, it's not true that it's possible that there's some other type of logic than what we call human logic, right? And he's sort of, he's not affirming that that's the case, but he does seem to be granting that premise for the sake of argument in order to, poke fun at his opponent here. But I would say that even God is subject to the same laws of logic that we are calling human logic. And I don't mean just our conception of God. I mean, God himself is subject to those same laws of logic. And I think that's important, that we conceive of those laws of logic being, universally applicable, apart from whether we're conceiving of it or not, right? And that's important to the nature of God, and the idea that God cannot contradict himself, that God cannot lie. It's not just that we can't conceive of God lying or contradicting himself. It's that he like metaphysically cannot do it. And so I think that's an important point to draw out here. Again, not necessarily disagreeing with Peikoff, but the implication in his thought experiment there might indicate otherwise. Does that make sense?
It did. It sounds like maybe what you're saying is that he missed a shot that he could have taken.
Yeah, it seems like, if I were Peikoff, I would say, you're right with the perception thing. Yes, it's stupid to say that that we would have to perceive, by no means whatsoever. But when you get to logic, it seems like Peikoff is also saying, yes, human logic is our means, and it's stupid to say that we shouldn't have a means. Whereas I would say it's better with logic to say, well, no, that there's no other possible type of logic. Logic just is what it is, human or not. It's not like it's not. So in other words, human logic isn't the same type of thing as our perceptual faculty, right? Because our perceptual faculty is different from animals' perceptual faculty, which could be different from a Martian's perceptual faculty. Those are all things that are unique to the individual perceiving things. Whereas logic, I don't think that there could be unique logics for man versus animal versus Martian. Does that make sense?
It does. Thank you for that. All right, let's go to, unless there's anything else we want to add, let's go to the bottom of this page. So this is page 49. We cannot escape. He's saying the argument that the Kantian makes amounts to this. We cannot escape the limitations of a human consciousness, the argument observes. We cannot escape our dependence on human senses, human concepts, human logic, the human brain. We cannot shed human identity. Therefore, the argument concludes, we cannot gain a knowledge of reality. And that is where we're about to arrive at what Andrew pointed out earlier. That if you're going to say that amounts to saying you're blind because you can see. That's the implication of this. So he summarizes it very eloquently. In other words, our consciousness is something that has specific means and forms of cognition. Therefore, it is disqualified as a faculty of cognition. Let's go into the next section. There's some minor quibbles I would have about his points about God there, which I don't think we had to go through. To the bottom of page 50. In this view, identity, the essence of existence, invalidates consciousness, every kind of consciousness. Or a means of knowledge makes knowledge impossible. This approach implies that man is blind because he has eyes, deaf because he has ears, deluded because he has a mind, and the things he perceives do not exist because he perceives them. So Rand rejects that. And then he points out this thing about how objectivists reject the idea of reality as it is, as a helpful phrase. There is just reality. There's just reality. So why are you using this phrase? This is causing us to get into trouble here. He says the phrase is a redundancy. There is no reality as it isn't. The world we perceive is not merely reality as it appears. And he has some helpful points in here. He says, well, he talks about how things appear, and he says things really do appear the way they really do appear. Come on. And a lot of this is just brushing aside useless objections. So there's one little point I want to make at the top of 51. He does say there is no difference in this context between what appears and what is real. I just want to make a qualification here. I don't think that he's saying that all that appears is that which is real and all that we have not seen is not real. He's not falling into that fallacy. I'm not sure if that fallacy has a name, but the idea that the only things that exist are the things that we know, and that if we don't know it, it doesn't exist.
But I wanted to comment on that real fast too, because I made a note on the top of 51 about that. I think that he might be overstating the case against Kant here. I hate saying that.
Yeah, that's harsh.
So I think that the distinction between things in themselves and our perception or even our conception of things is helpful, as long as you're not drawing a dichotomy between those things, right? Because for the same reason that you just pointed out, Cody, that there is more to the thing in itself than what we are aware of whenever we're perceiving it, or even when we're conceiving of it, right? And the acknowledgement that there's more to the thing in itself than our conception of it is what leads us to the conviction that we have to we have to allow our definitions to be revisable, right? Because we might discover more about the thing in itself than what was present in our conception of it. So I think it's still a valuable and important distinction to make. We just need to be careful not to draw the same irrational conclusions.
Let's go to the middle of page 51. He writes, and this is in italics, identity is not the disqualifier of consciousness, but its precondition. And anything that's conscious clearly has identity, so I'm going to agree with that. Next sentence, this is the base from which epistemology must proceed. It is the principle by reference to which all standards of cognition must be defined. Now, right there, he is laying the groundwork for what is going to happen later on when he gets to the theory of concepts, when he gets to epistemology proper. He's going to point out that if you're going to have an epistemology at all, your epistemology must be based on standards of cognition, and the standard is that consciousness has identity. And so you can see how that's going to pay off if you're familiar with their theory of concepts, that their theory of concepts involves accounting for what it is that man's consciousness is doing and what man's specific consciousness, the nature of it is. And in this case, it's the conceptual consciousness. And so they have to give an account for concepts. And so that's why he's pointing this out here. I see a comment from Andrew. I do think it would be helpful to demonstrate why his comments about means of perception don't apply to God. Okay. Any thoughts on that, Andrew?
I have some thoughts on that too, and I'm sorry I was away when that got covered. But Andrew, go ahead if you had more elaboration on that question.
I'll set it up, and you can.
Okay.
You probably be able to phrase this better than me, but this happens with objectivists a lot, where they'll set the terms of what anything that exists has to be based on their knowledge up until God's existence is demonstrated. And they say, if God did exist, it wouldn't match what we know about other things, and so we don't even have to consider it, which kind of goes against their general principle that we just mentioned, that all concepts and our understanding is always open to revision. And so right here is an example where he says all consciousness is perceiving reality through some means, where the reality existence kind of causes in some way our perception of it, which we, especially if you hold to a classical theism, you're going to say that's not how God perceives. So maybe Jacob, you could explain briefly what we mean by saying God knows or God perceives existence, and why his kind of jab doesn't really land.
Yeah, to put it as bluntly as possible in sort of contra-objectivist terms, I would say that God's consciousness is primary to creation, not primary to his own existence, but primary to his creation, in a similar or analogous way that an author's consciousness is primary to the creation of a novel that he writes, right? And so God's consciousness of reality that is not himself is more like that. He conceives of it before it is instantiated. For him, the conception of it, so it's sort of backwards from us, right? There's God's consciousness. God conceives of the idea of something, and then he instantiates a physical material instance of that thing that he conceived. We perceive that physical instance, and then based on that physical instance of the thing, we conceptualize it. So our conceptual, our conscious, our faculty of consciousness is working almost in reverse of God's. Does that make sense?
I've always thought that ever since I first started thinking about this, and I think that I'm not saying this is what the biblical author was thinking here with this term, Moses, I guess, but the image of God, that certainly does look like a mirror process where God makes us and then has us basically reverse engineer what he's made, which I think is beautiful to think about. So Cody, I think we should probably move on from that, but I just wanted to throw that in case anybody was like going to read this and be kind of confused about how Christianity would fit in there.
Great. Okay, let me wrap up the reading. At the bottom of page 51, there's some potent points. So I'll start kind of out of order, but he points out that the fact that the object is reality cannot be used to deny that we know it by a specific human means. It takes a while, for me at least, to wrap my mind around what in the world he's saying there. But the fact that the object is reality cannot be used to deny that we know it by a specific human means. And I think if you understood that, you'd understand why Ventilianism is wrong. And then he also points out the fact that there is a means, the fact of a means, cannot be used to deny that the object of cognition is reality. So either way, like there's two sides. There's the reality and there's the reason. The fact that reality is involved does not invalidate reason. The fact that reason is involved does not invalidate reality. And he summarizes those two kinds of errors. One of them is typical of the skeptic. The skeptic would be the one that would say that, since we have a means, that therefore we can't really be sure that there is a reality. Because we're using our reason, we cannot really be sure that there's a reality. Whereas the mystic, and I think this maybe both of these apply to Van Til, but this one definitely does. The mystic would be the one that says that, because the object is real, therefore we need to deny the means by which we gain knowledge. I think that is, I'd have to demonstrate that, but I think if you're familiar with Van Til, you can see that is the flow of their thought. Any reactions to that? Okay, I'm going to go to one final question, and that is one that Andrew had brought up in a previous week that I wanted to make sure to get to today. So, Andrew, would you like to read that C.S. Lewis quote?
Yeah, the question, here's the C.S. Lewis quote, and I kind of want to ask us, like, in light of what we've been talking about here, do we agree with it? Because I don't know. The quotation from Lewis is, I think this is from Mere Christianity, says, if we find ourselves with a desire that nothing in this world can satisfy, the most probable explanation is that we were made for another world. So I don't know whether I would think that's true. It has something to do with a sense of life, or a kind of a sense that we get from life, that, you know, when someone that we love dies, we think that's just not right. And this came up in the context of, like, the metaphysically given, you know, and I was thinking, like, it seems like an objectivist might even be able to agree somewhat with this quote, but obviously not the conclusion. And so I just wanted to ask about this. Like, do you guys think that this is valid, a valid way to think, or not?
Jacob, what are your thoughts on that one?
So I would say that the argument itself is poor. You can't reason from a desire to reality, because it's just as likely that your desire is deformed, right? You know, I could find myself the desire to slaughter people, and the fact that reality doesn't allow me to do that, or you know, maybe a little bit more, I can find myself the desire to live and thrive without doing any work, and reality doesn't allow me to do that, right? Does that mean that I was created for a reality in which I could do that? Well, a lot of Christian socialists would say yes. And they might even use that as an argument for, you know, communism being the ideal. So I would reject that, the form of argument. But I think I agree with the point that you're trying to get at, Andrew, which is that for the objectivists, death seems like a bad thing, even though they can't say that, right? Because they have to just say, well, death is just part of reality. It just is what it is. But it seems like it should be otherwise. And to them, even, they probably feel like it should be otherwise. But in order to establish that it really, in fact, ought to be otherwise, you would have to point to other facts in reality, which we could point to as Christians, rather than pointing to the mere feeling that it feels like it should be otherwise. Does that make sense?
I appreciate that, Jacob. Andrew, did you have any other points that you wanted to make about that?
Nope. Like I said, I didn't know what I thought about that, so I just thought that it'd be good to get other heads in the room to kind of chime in. So I do think that we have this, because I was thinking about Peikoff and what you shared a couple of weeks ago about his mourning when Ayn Rand passed away, and you know, he says later on that, you know, emotions are a product of our volitional thoughts. You know, they're a product of our premises. And so I just think, what premises would lead to death being so sad? Because, I mean, he says the fact that we are destructible, you know, he uses the indestructible robot example, so the fact that we are destructible and are mortal is what gives rise to the possibility of values. So why should you be sad about someone's death? I don't have an answer to that. I don't know if that really is a true objection to Peikoff's premises here, but it just got me thinking.
Yeah, one thought that comes to mind is just that on their framework, when you do have a definition of value which is oriented to this world and to the collecting of things that help you in your own prosperity, losing somebody else is losing something that is helpful to your prosperity. So I don't have any difficulty understanding why, even on their logic, on their framework, to lose somebody is a cause for mourning. It's just that, I think that they could probably separate it. In one sense, we mourn for the loss of a particular person, but that what they're wanting to say is that we shouldn't mourn at the metaphysical fact of death itself, and they can distinguish between those two things. And even as a Christian, I distinguish between those two things, but the difference is that I mourn for both of them. All right, well, let me just say thank you for everybody that's been watching the video on Facebook Live. If you could share it, and if you would come for our discussion next Saturday, same time, 9 a.m. Eastern, we're going to get into free will or volition. What is free will, and how is it related to the topics we've been discussing so far about the kind of things that our mind does? And the issue will be centered around the idea of focus. You have the ability to direct your own mind to focus on things. On this topic of free will, it's going to be kind of interesting because most of the people here watching, not all of them, but most of them, are coming from a Reformed Christian background, or at least a Calvinist Christian background, Calvinist Baptists. So there's going to be a big point of disagreement between the Objectivists and us on the topic of how does God's sovereignty relate to our volition. And much of it is going to boil down to definitions, but we'll be addressing topics such as libertarian free will, which is probably the position that all or most Objectivists hold to, and we're going to be able to engage with that. I'm looking forward to Jacob doing the brunt of the work there. Well, thank you guys, and make sure to give this video a share, and if you want to join next week, go to christianintellectual.com/objectivism, and make sure that you are on our email list, please. You can go to christianintellectual.com/subscribe, and you'll get email updates. You'll get an inside look at what we are doing. Well, thank you for joining, and I will see you next Saturday. God bless.